Black Americans are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted. For one woman, that statistic was a 16-year sentence, a prison cell, and a Korean textbook. Today, she stands on the steps of the Seoul Central District Court, fluent, free, and facing the man who put her there. This is not a reunion. This is a reckoning. Her name is Maya Johnson. At 22, a rushed trial and concealed evidence sent her to prison for a murder she did not commit. For 16 years, her only window to the world was a language book. Now she has one question for the prosecutor who buried the truth. Do you remember me? This is the story of a conviction built on lies, a revenge built on verbs, and a day in court where the roles of victim and accuser are finally about to reverse. It began on a rainy Thursday in October 2003. Maya Johnson was a college student, working a late shift at a downtown convenience store in Cleveland to pay her tuition. At 10:45 p.m., a man in a dark hoodie entered, waved a gun, and demanded cash from the register. Maya complied. As he fled, a second man, a regular customer named Ben Carter, entered. He saw the robber's face. He saw Maya unharmed but shaken. He called the police. 2 hours later, Ben Carter was found dead in an alley 2 blocks away, shot twice in the chest. The investigation was chaotic, under pressure to solve a murder in a high-crime area. The security tape was grainy. The gun was never found. But there was one lead, a single partial fingerprint on the store counter, not Maya's. The detective on the case, a veteran with a high closure rate, focused elsewhere. He had a witness who claimed, under aggressive questioning, to have seen Maya arguing with Ben Carter earlier that week. It was a dispute over a mistaken charge on a credit card slip, resolved in 30 seconds. To the police, it became a motive. The prosecutor assigned was a young, ambitious assistant district attorney named Park Jae-hoon. He was building a reputation for being tough, efficient, and winning. The case against Maya was circumstantial, but he had a narrative, a robbery gone wrong, a witness eliminated. He had the argued motive. He had a witness statement, later recanted, placing her near the alley. He did not have the full forensic report. That report from the state lab noted the unknown fingerprint and found gunshot residue on the victim's clothing inconsistent with a close-range altercation. This report was listed in the evidence log but never entered into the trial record. The defense, an overworked public defender with 200 active cases, did not catch the omission. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury was all white. Maya's court-appointed attorney presented no witnesses. He focused on reasonable doubt but couldn't explain the missed fingerprint. Park Jae-hoon's closing argument was succinct. He pointed at Maya. She was there. He saw the robber. She knew he could identify him. Or perhaps, he paused, letting the implication hang, she was more involved than she's letting on. You have a duty to give this family justice. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, Maya stood before the judge. Park Jae-hoon requested the maximum, citing the brutality of the crime and the need to protect the community. Maya turned to him, her voice quiet but clear in the silent courtroom. You know you're wrong. He did not look at her. The judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. She was 22 years old. The bus ride to the Ohio Reformatory for Women was a blur of chain link and gray sky. Processing was a nightmare of uniforms, numbers, and cold efficiency. Her new world was an 8-by-10-foot cell, a metal bed, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The first month was survival. The second was despair. Then, in the prison library, a tattered donation box yielded a book. Its cover was a faded blue. The title was in elegant, unfamiliar script, Kohentuhain, Korchatkatum Ain, First Steps in Korean. It was random, it was arbitrary, a book left behind by a missionary group. For Maya, it was a lifeline, not to escape the walls, but to escape the mind-numbing sameness of her sentence. She started that night under the dim cell light, sounding out letters, Hangul ko hyuten, Hangul ko ein, Hangul ko nyun, Hangul ko gia, and Hangul ko uin, Hangul ko gia, Hanguk, Korea, a place she knew nothing about, a language with no connection to her pain. That was the point. She requested more books. A sympathetic librarian, Ms. Higgins, began setting aside donations, a grammar guide, a Korean English dictionary missing its cover, a book of folk tales. Maya's cell became a classroom. She practiced writing the alphabet on the back of commissary forms. She labeled everything she could see, Ko Chungmun and window asterisk. Kommun ein door asterisk, Kochhimde ein bed asterisk. Her roommate, an older woman named Lorraine doing time for fraud, would quiz her. "What's this?" pointing to the toilet. "Kopyanhi," Maya would say, and Lorraine would cackle. "Girl, you planning a heist in Seoul." The work was grueling. She had no teacher, no native speaker, just the crackle of an old radio, sometimes picking up a shortwave signal from who knows where. She recorded herself reading on a contraband cassette player, playing it back to hear the jarring difference between her accent and the brittle audio from a textbook tape. But in the precision of grammar, the puzzle of particles like kornun, ein and korger, ein, she found a strange peace. The language demanded absolute focus. It left no room to think about the past, about the trial, about Park Jae-hoon. For 3 hours a day, she wasn't inmate number W43108. She was a student. Years folded into one another. She achieved intermediate fluency. She read Korean news articles smuggled in by Ms. Higgins, slowly parsing stories about politics, culture, something called the Korean Wave. She learned that Park Jae-hoon, the prosecutor, had left the Ohio DA's office. A news clipping from 2008, passed along by a legal aid volunteer, mentioned his move. He had taken a prestigious position as a senior international prosecutor in Seoul, South Korea, part of a bilateral legal exchange program. He was building a new career across the world, hailed as an expert in cross-border justice. Maya read the article in her cell, the Korean script now clear to her. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The man who had buried the evidence that could have freed her was now a respected figure in another country's legal system. He had literally moved on while she remained in a concrete box, learning his new homeland's language by accident. It wasn't despair she felt. It was a target. Her study was no longer an escape. It was preparation. She requested law books. She studied Korean legal procedure. She wrote letters in increasingly fluent Korean to innocence projects, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. All were ignored or returned. Then in 2016, a break. A true crime podcast, digging into old unsolved murders, featured the Ben Carter case. The host obtained the original case file through a public records request. He read the full, unredacted forensic report on air, the one with the unidentified fingerprint and the gunshot residue analysis. Listeners flooded the Cleveland DA's office with questions. A newly elected district attorney, under public pressure, announced a case review. The reinvestigation took 2 more years. The fingerprint was run through an updated national database. It matched a man named Derek Mills, a small-time felon with a history of armed robbery who had been killed in a drug deal in 2005. His known accomplice, upon arrest on unrelated charges, confessed to the convenience store robbery and, panicking, to the murder of Ben Carter, who had recognized him from the neighborhood. The ballistics matched a gun found in the accomplice's possession. On a bright, cold morning in March 2019, Maya Johnson walked out of the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She was 38 years old. She had spent 16 years, 2 months, and 14 days inside. The compensation from the state would take years to litigate. The apology from the city was a form letter. But she had one possession of value, her mind, and the language she had forged within it. She was fluent in Korean, and she knew exactly where Park Jae-hoon worked. The cliffhanger wasn't her freedom, it was her first action with it. She booked a one-way ticket to Seoul. Incheon International Airport was a symphony of noise Maya understood perfectly. Announcements in Korean, directions to the high-speed rail, the rhythm of a city moving at light speed. She had practiced this moment in her cell for years, but nothing prepared her for the reality of Seoul. It was a city of brutalist concrete and glowing neon, of serene palaces and 12-lane highways, and everywhere, the eyes. The subtle glances at a tall black woman navigating with the focused intensity of a local, speaking their language with a strange, textbook-perfect accent. She was invisible and hypervisible all at once. She rented a small one-room apartment, a *Gashiwan, in a nondescript neighborhood near the Seoul Central District Court. It was just big enough for a bed, a desk, and her single suitcase. Her mission was simple on paper: find Park Jae-hoon and make him see her. But how? She couldn't just walk into the Supreme Prosecutor's office. She needed a strategy, an entry point. Her first week was reconnaissance. She visited the courthouse, watching the flow of black-robed prosecutors and lawyers. She sat in on public hearings, absorbing the formal, hierarchical rhythm of Korean justice. It was a system built on respect for authority, on unspoken rules. Her very presence was a disruption. Her breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a community center for foreign workers. She volunteered, helping translate documents for migrant laborers from Ghana and Nigeria. There she heard stories of their own struggles with the legal system, unpaid wages, immigration issues, encounters with prosecutors who saw them as problems, not people. One man, Kwame, told her about a young Korean lawyer who sometimes helped pro bono. "He's different," Kwame said. "He listens." The lawyer's name was Kim Seok-ju. He was in his early 30s, idealistic but weary. Maya approached him after a legal clinic, speaking in careful Korean. She didn't tell him her full story, not yet. She presented herself as a researcher, an exoneree from America studying comparative justice systems. She was curious about the role of prosecutors. Kim was intrigued by her fluency and her perspective. Over bitter coffee, he gave her the lay of the land. "Prosecutors here have more power than judges," he explained. "They decide whether to indict, what to charge. The system trusts them absolutely. It makes them untouchable until they are." He mentioned offhand a recent controversy. A mid-level prosecutor had been accused of coercing a confession in a high-profile embezzlement case. The evidence was shaky, but the conviction stood. The prosecutor's name was not Park Jae-hoon, but the method, the pressure, the disregard for exculpatory evidence, it rang a bell so loud it was a vibration in Maya's bones. She asked how such a prosecutor could be held accountable. Kim laughed, a short, humorless sound. "By a bigger prosecutor. Or by the media after a huge scandal. There is no civil suit. There is no 'I'm sorry.'" This was the first wall. The system was designed to protect itself. Park Jae-hoon wasn't just a man, he was a cog in a powerful, self-validating machine. Her personal confrontation was meaningless unless it could crack the machine itself. She needed leverage. She needed what he valued most, his reputation. She began to dig. Park Jae-hoon's public profile was polished. Articles praised his work on international fraud cases. He gave lectures at Seoul National University. His LinkedIn profile, which she studied in an internet cafe, showed a seamless career ascent. Cleveland, Seoul, a master's degree in international law from a Korean university, completed while working. She focused on the Cleveland years. Using her limited funds, she paid for access to a private investigator database back in the States. She requested every public filing from her own case, every news article, every record of Park's time at the DA's office. The documents arrived in a digital dump, and there, buried in a procedural motion from a different case he prosecuted in 2004, was a golden thread. In that case, a drug possession charge, the defense had filed a Brady motion, accusing Park of failing to disclose evidence favorable to the defendant. The judge had denied the motion for lack of specific proof, but the allegation was on the record. A pattern requires more than one point. She dug deeper, searching legal databases for any mention of his name alongside misconduct, Brady, disclosure. She found two more, a 2006 armed robbery case where a key witness recanted, claiming Park had pressured her. The conviction was upheld on appeal. A 2007 burglary case where the defense argued the police report had been altered. The appellate court ruled it a harmless error. 3 cases, 3 motions alleging prosecutorial overreach, all dismissed. In the American system, they were blips, not bombshells, but Maya had lived inside one of those blips. She knew their true weight. She now had a question: did this pattern follow him to Korea? The Korean legal system, she learned, had its own version of disclosure rules, its own principles of prosecutorial ethics. Violations were rare and punishments rarer, but a foreign prosecutor, especially one on a prestigious exchange, would be under extra scrutiny. Any whiff of past controversy could be damaging. Her next step was audacious. She decided to audit one of his university lectures. Dressed in neat, neutral clothing, she blended in with the students at SNU. The lecture hall was full. Park Jae-hoon walked in, confident, smiling. He was older, his hair grayer, but his demeanor was the same, the calm, unassailable authority she remembered from the courtroom. His lecture was on ethical challenges in transnational prosecution. He spoke of integrity, of the prosecutor's duty to be a minister of justice. Maya sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap, listening to the man who had locked her away lecture on ethics. The irony was a physical taste, metallic and sour. After the lecture, students swarmed him with questions. She waited until the crowd thinned. Then she walked up, her heart a drum against her ribs. She spoke in clear, formal Korean. "Professor Park, thank you for the lecture. I have a question about disclosure obligations. In your experience, how does a prosecutor ensure the defense receives all exculpatory material, especially when the evidence is inconvenient?" He looked at her, a flicker of surprise at her fluency, then a polite professional mask settled. "A thorough review process is essential. The system has checks. The prosecutor's conscience is the ultimate check. And if the system's check fails, if the prosecutor's conscience is quiet," she asked, holding his gaze. His smile tightened slightly. "Then the appellate courts are there to correct. No system is perfect, but we strive for it." He was already turning away, his body language signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for your question." He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. She was a footnote in his past, a case number. The encounter was a failure and a revelation. A direct, personal approach would not work. He was insulated by his position, his ego, the entire architecture of his new life. She needed to change tactics. She needed to become not a person, but a problem he couldn't ignore. Her solution was the media. But the mainstream Korean press was conservative, unlikely to take a risky story from a foreign exoneree about a decades-old American case. She needed a backdoor. Through the foreign worker community, she heard about an online independent news outlet run by a young journalist named Lee Jun, who specialized in investigative pieces about power and injustice. He had a small team, but a reputation for tenacity. Maya crafted an email in flawless Korean. She was concise, an American woman, wrongfully convicted, exonerated after 16 years. The prosecutor who withheld evidence now held a senior position in Seoul. She had documents. She requested a meeting. Lee Jun replied within 3 hours. They met in a quiet cafe. Maya laid out her story, from the convenience store to the prison library to the lecture hall. She showed him the case documents, the Brady motions from Ohio, the exoneration order. Lee Jun was sharp, asking precise questions about the Korean legal angle. "This is an American story," he said finally. "My readers care about what happens here. Why is this relevant to Seoul?" This was the pivot. Maya took a breath. "It's relevant because the man who abused his power there is here. He teaches future Korean prosecutors about ethics. He decides cases that affect people's lives in this country. His pattern didn't start in Seoul, but what if it didn't end in Cleveland? What if he brought that same, quiet conscience with him?" Lee Jun's eyes lit up. He understood. They weren't just doing a story about the past. They were investigating the present. Was Park Jae-hoon a changed man, or was he a risk? Their investigation would have 2 prongs. First, thoroughly document the American misconduct. Second, and crucially, scrutinize his record in Korea, every case he had touched since arriving. This was the escalation. It was no longer Maya against Park. It was a journalistic investigation, with Maya as the primary source and a guiding force. Lee Jun assigned a researcher to comb through Korean court records for Park's cases. The work was slow, painstaking. They looked for anomalies, cases with high acquittal rates on appeal, sudden changes in testimony, allegations from defense attorneys. Weeks passed. Maya continued her life in the Gashiwan, the anticipation a constant hum. Then Lee Jun called. His voice was tense with excitement. "We found something, a case from 2 years ago, financial fraud. The defendant, a mid-level office manager, was convicted. He appealed. The appeal was denied last month, but our researcher found a discrepancy in the evidence log. A forensic accounting report was submitted by the defense during the trial. It suggested the fraud could have been committed by a supervisor. The prosecution's closing argument never mentioned it. The court's opinion doesn't address it. It's like it disappeared." "Was Park the lead prosecutor?" Maya asked, her mouth dry. "He was the supervising prosecutor on the case. He signed the indictment. He would have seen all the evidence. Whether he directed it to be buried, we can't prove that yet. But the pattern, you see it." Maya saw it. It was the same move, the inconvenient evidence, the quiet omission. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a shadow in the exact same shape. They had their Korean connection. Lee Jun believed they had enough for a story, but he wanted more. He wanted to confront Park with the findings from both countries. He asked Maya the critical question, "Are you willing to be named? To have your face and your story published here, it will put you directly in his crosshairs." This was the bridge. Going public in Korea meant burning any semblance of anonymity. It meant the Korean justice system would have to look at her and at him. It meant inviting a storm of public scrutiny, potential legal backlash, and the wrath of a powerful man. She looked out the window of her tiny room at the Seoul skyline, a forest of glass and ambition where Park Jae-hoon had built his fortress. She had crossed an ocean to ask him a question. Now she was about to give him an answer, broadcast on the front page of the digital news. She said yes. The article went live at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The headline was direct. A prosecutor's past. American exoneree alleges misconduct by senior Seoul prosecutor. It named Maya Johnson. It named Park Jae-hoon. It detailed the suppressed fingerprint evidence from Cleveland, the 3 dismissed Brady motions, the 16-year wrongful imprisonment. And it presented the Korean case, the missing forensic accounting report, the conviction of the office manager, the unanswered questions. Lee Jun's piece was meticulous, forensic. It didn't scream guilt. It laid out a pattern and asked, simply, does this belong here? The reaction was a quake. For the first few hours, it was confined to legal circles and media Twitter. By noon, it was trending. The English-language Korea Herald picked it up, then the mainstream networks. The story had everything: international intrigue, a shocking injustice, a David and Goliath dynamic with a twist. David was a black woman who spoke fluent Korean. News crews camped outside the Supreme Prosecutor's office. The official response was a terse, one-line statement. The matters referenced concern a foreign jurisdiction and are not within our purview. Prosecutor Park's work in Korea has been exemplary. But the story wouldn't die. Online, the conversation split. Some condemned Park as a corrupt symbol of a broken system. Others attacked Maya. Comment sections filled with xenophobia. She's just trying to get money and fame. Why is she stirring up old trouble here? She should be grateful she's free. The foreign worker community, however, rallied around her. They shared her story on their forums. They understood powerlessness. Maya's Geshiwan landlord, a kindly old man, slid a note under her door. Be careful. Powerful men have long shadows. Park Jae-hoon's shadow moved quickly. 2 days after the article, Maya received a registered letter. It was from a prestigious Seoul law firm. It was a cease and desist letter demanding she retract all defamatory and false statements about Prosecutor Park and issue a public apology, or face a civil lawsuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter cited Korea's strict defamation laws, which can criminalize even true statements if they are deemed to harm someone's reputation without a sufficient public interest defense. It was a classic intimidation tactic. The message was clear: shut up, or we will use the system to crush you. Lee Jun was furious. They're trying to bully you into silence. This is their first move. He connected Maya with a bold human rights lawyer, attorney Hong Soo-jin, known for taking on defamation suits against powerful figures. Hong reviewed the letter and scoffed. They have no case on the merits. The public interest is overwhelming, but they want to drain you financially, emotionally. They want you to run back to America. Maya had a different thought. The lawsuit was a threat, but it was also an opportunity. It was a formal, legal engagement. It was a door opening. She instructed attorney Hong not to respond to the retraction demand. Instead, they would file a preemptive motion, not a defense, but an attack. They petitioned the Seoul Central District Court to allow Maya to give a formal, sworn deposition about her experiences to be entered into the public record in anticipation of the expected defamation suit. The legal maneuvering was complex, but the goal was simple: force the Korean court to officially hear her story. To make Park's past the court's present. The court surprisingly granted the request. The legal community was watching. The deposition was scheduled. The night before, Maya couldn't sleep. She wasn't rehearsing lines. She was thinking of her 22-year-old self, terrified in that courtroom. She was thinking of her grandmother, who had died while she was inside, believing her granddaughter was a murderer. She was thinking of the Korean verbs for to testify, to witness, to remember. The deposition room was small, wood-paneled. A court stenographer, Attorney Hong, and a lawyer from Park's firm, a stern woman in a sharp suit, were present. No judge, no Park. For 3 hours Maya spoke. She answered Hong's questions in Korean, then carefully repeated her core statements in English for the record. She described the convenience store, the fingerprint, the trial, the moment Park requested a life sentence. She described the prison library, the blue book, the sound of her own voice mispronouncing vowels in the dark. She described reading the article about his promotion in Seoul. She was calm, precise, devastating. Park's lawyer objected frequently, coldly. Relevance, hearsay, prejudicial. Then Hong asked the final question. Why are you here, Ms. Johnson? Why come to Korea? Maya looked directly at the stenographer's machine as if speaking to the record itself. Because he is here, and because I'm sorry was never an option. I needed to ask a question he couldn't ignore. What do you do with a prosecutor who loses his conscience? The deposition ended. The transcript, a 200-page document, became a public filing. Lee Jun published key excerpts. The narrative deepened. But Park's counterattack wasn't over. A week later, a new story emerged, this time in a pro-establishment newspaper. It questioned Maya's character. It mentioned a shoplifting arrest when she was a teenager, a single dismissed charge. It quoted anonymous former neighbors, suggesting her family was troubled. It was a smear, a classic playbook move, discredit the accuser. The article also hinted, darkly, that Maya's sudden appearance in Korea and her coordination with a left-leaning journalist suggested a possible political motivation, an attempt to embarrass the Korean justice system. The blow landed. The online vitriol against Maya intensified. She felt it in the streets, in the stares that lasted a beat too long. Kim Seok-ju, the young lawyer who had first helped her, called, his voice full of apology. The system is closing ranks. They're painting you as an outsider trying to attack one of their own. It's ugly and it's effective. This was the wait, it gets worse moment. It wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about her integrity, her very right to seek accountability. She was being portrayed as a manipulative foreigner, a pawn in some vague political game. The loneliness was acute. She was in a foreign country, fighting a legal and media war on two fronts, with her own past being weaponized against her. Then the email arrived. It was from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was, "Your case, Cleveland." The message was brief, anonymous. "I was a paralegal in the DA's office in 2003. I remember the folder on your case. There was a sticky note on it from Park to his supervisor. It said, 'No noise on this one, close it.' I always wondered, be careful." Attached was a grainy, scanned image of a case file cover sheet. In the margin, in handwriting she had seen on legal motions, were the words, "No noise, close it." Her hands shook. This wasn't just negligence, this was intent. This was a directive to avoid scrutiny. This was the missing piece between a mistake and a cover-up. But it was anonymous, unverifiable, potentially inadmissible. Yet it changed everything for her. It confirmed the coldest truth: her life had been collateral damage in his career calculation. She shared it with Attorney Hong and Lee Jun. They were energized but cautious. "This is dynamite," Lee said, "but we can't publish it without verifying the source. And if we can't, it's just a rumor that makes us look desperate." They needed a way to force the issue into the open, to shift from a media war to a concrete legal proceeding. Hong found the mechanism. She discovered that under a relatively unused clause in the U.S.-Korea Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, there was a pathway for judicial authorities in one country to formally request information from the other for use in a pending legal proceeding. The defamation suit Park was threatening constituted such a proceeding. Hong drafted a bold motion to the Korean court. They requested the court to formally ask the U.S. Department of Justice for the complete, unredacted personnel and disciplinary file of former Assistant District Attorney Park Jae-hoon from Cuyahoga County, Ohio. The motion argued that Park's state of mind and professional history was central to the defamation case. Was Maya's statement that he buried evidence defamatory, or was it a truthful assertion of fact? The only way to know was to examine his record. It was a legal Hail Mary. If granted, it would internationalize the scandal and force American authorities to potentially cough up damning documents. If denied, it would show the Korean court's reluctance to seek the truth. The filing of this motion was the major transition. It changed the game from she said, he said in the press to a formal international legal discovery request. It raised the stakes for everyone, for the Korean court, for the US Department of Justice, and for Park Jae-hoon, whose past was now the subject of a potential transnational subpoena. The news of the motion broke. Legal analysts debated its chances. The American embassy in Seoul gave a no comment. The story was no longer about Maya versus Park. It was about the system itself and whether it would look away or be compelled to look back. The stage was set for the final, public reckoning. The confrontation was no longer a question of if, but of how and under whose rules. The Seoul Central District Court did not grant the motion, but it did something more surprising. It scheduled a hearing, not a trial, but a special procedural hearing to determine the merits of the defamation claim and the relevance of foreign disciplinary records. The judge assigned was a respected senior judge known for his independence. The message was clear: the court would not be a rubber stamp. It would look, but it would do so on its own terms. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. The media frenzy reignited. This would be the first time Maya and Park Jae-hoon would be in the same room since her sentencing 16 years prior. The courtroom was packed. International reporters mixed with Korean press. A row of law students sat in the back watching legal history unfold. Maya entered with attorney Hong. She wore a simple, tailored navy suit. She looked not like a victim, but like a witness. Park arrived minutes later, surrounded by aides, his face a mask of professional composure. He did not glance her way. The hearing began with dry procedural arguments. Park's legal team argued vehemently that the case was a straightforward defamation matter. Maya's statements were false and damaging. Her motivations were vindictive. Bringing in ancient American personnel files was a fishing expedition, an invasion of privacy, and a disrespect to the Korean legal system. Attorney Hong stood. Her argument was different. She spoke not just of defamation law, but of justice. This hearing is not about one woman's words. It is about the integrity of a prosecutor who stands before you. The truth of her words is the only defense, and the truth lies in his record. We are not asking this court to convict him of anything. We are asking it to seek the truth before it silences the person telling it. Then the judge did something unexpected. He turned to Park Jae-hoon, who was sitting at the counsel table. Prosecutor Park, you are not a party to this civil suit, but you are its subject. This court has discretion. I would hear from you directly. What is your response to the core allegation that you knowingly failed to disclose exculpatory evidence in Ohio, leading to this woman's wrongful imprisonment? A silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Park. He stood slowly, adjusting his robe. He spoke in Korean, his voice calm, measured. Your Honor, I served the state of Ohio with dedication. The case in question was tried before a jury, with a defense attorney, under the full oversight of the court. Any suggestion that I acted unethically is belied by the fact that my conduct was never sanctioned by any bar association or court. The exoneration, while tragic, was the result of new evidence, not misconduct. This hearing and these allegations are a personal vendetta dressed up as a legal inquiry. I have nothing to hide, but I object to this spectacle. It was a solid, defensive performance. He was relying on the technicality, no official sanction. The judge listened, impassive. Then he looked at Maya. Ms. Johnson, you have listened to his response. Is there anything you wish to say? This was the moment, the question she had crossed an ocean to answer. Maya stood. She did not look at the judge first. She turned and faced Park Jae-hoon directly. When she spoke, she used Korean, but with a clarity and formality that commanded the room. Prosecutor Park, you say you have nothing to hide, but you hid a fingerprint report. You say there was no misconduct, but 3 defense attorneys filed motions saying you hid evidence. You say this is a vendetta. I did not choose you. You chose my case. You chose to close it with no noise. She paused, letting the phrase, the anonymous note's phrase, hang in the air. She saw a flicker in his eyes, recognition, then alarm. 16 years is not a vendetta. It is a life sentence. You asked the judge in Cleveland for a life sentence for me. Today, I'm not asking for a sentence for you. I'm asking for one thing you never gave me, accountability. Look at me. And tell this court, on your honor, that you disclosed every piece of evidence. The room was utterly still. Park Jae-hoon's mask finally cracked. It was not guilt, but a towering, cold fury at being challenged so directly in his own language in his own court. He opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand. That is not a question for witness examination. The judge turned back to the legal issue, but the confrontation had happened. It had been witnessed by the court, by the press, by the world. The legal truth was still pending, but the human truth had been televised. The judge recessed to consider the motion for international discovery. 2 days later, his ruling was issued. He denied the formal request under the Mutual Assistance Treaty, calling it overly broad. But in a stunning move, he used his inherent authority to order a different remedy. He stated that the credibility of Prosecutor Park was indeed a central issue. Therefore, he ordered Park to submit a sworn affidavit to the court, addressing the specific allegations about the Ohio case and the Brady motions. The affidavit would be reviewed in camera, privately, by the judge. Based on that review, the judge would decide whether the defamation case had merit or should be dismissed. It was a Solomonic decision. It gave Park a chance to explain himself without a public airing of dirty laundry, but it forced him to go on the record, under oath, to a judge who would scrutinize every word. For Park, it was a trap. A vague denial wouldn't suffice. The judge would compare his affidavit to the existing court documents from America. Perjury would be a career-ending crime. Pressure began to build from within his own office. Colleagues started distancing themselves. The Korean media, sensing blood in the water, dug harder into his domestic cases. Another discrepancy was found in an old fraud indictment. The Whisper network grew loud. 1 week before the affidavit was due, Park Jae-hoon submitted a request to the court. He was withdrawing his threat of a defamation lawsuit against Maya Johnson. The case was dismissed with prejudice. His legal team issued a statement to avoid further burden on the judiciary and to prevent the continued exploitation of this personal matter. Prosecutor Park is ceasing all legal action. He maintains the allegations are false, but wishes to put this matter behind him. It was a surrender, a strategic retreat to avoid the affidavit, to avoid putting anything on the record. The news exploded. Headlines declared victory for Maya. The foreign worker communities celebrated, but for Maya it felt hollow. There was no admission, no accountability, just a tactical retreat. He would remain in his position, his reputation wounded but not destroyed. She had forced a draw, not a checkmate. Then came the final, surprising detail. The day after the lawsuit was dropped, Maya received a visitor at her Gashiwan asterisk. It was not a reporter or a lawyer. It was a middle-aged Korean woman in a modest suit, bowing deeply at her door. She introduced herself as Choi Mai-kyung. She was the older sister of the office manager convicted in the financial fraud case, the case with the missing accounting report. She had read every article about Maya. She had seen her speak in court. "You gave me courage," Ms. Choi said, her eyes filling with tears. "My brother, he lost everything, his job, his marriage. He always said the report was missing, but no one listened. After your story came out, his new lawyer filed a motion for a retrial. The court just agreed to review it." She grasped Maya's hands. "You came here for your justice, but you gave us a chance for ours, thank you." This was the real payoff. It wasn't about Park's job or a public confession. It was about the ripple effect. Maya's fight had created a crack in the wall, and light was streaming through for someone else. Her vengeance had transformed into advocacy. The story was no longer just Maya Johnson versus Park Jae-hoon. It was about the silent victims in both countries, connected by a pattern of buried evidence. The aftermath was a mix of quiet resolution and new purpose. Park Jae-hoon was quietly transferred out of his high-profile supervisory role at the Supreme Prosecutor's Office. He was moved to a research position, a clear demotion. His lecture invitations dried up. He became a cautionary tale, a ghost in the system. He never spoke publicly about Maya again. Maya, however, was just beginning. With the pro bono help of attorney Hong and Kim Seok-ju, she established a small non-profit foundation, funded partly by her eventual settlement from Ohio. They called it the Unseen Evidence Project. Its mission was twofold: to provide support and legal resources to exonerees in the United States, and to offer translation and legal guidance to migrant workers facing injustice in South Korea. She became a bridge. Her first hire was Lee Jun, the journalist, to lead public investigations. On a bright autumn day, Maya stood once more on the steps of the Seoul Central District Court. This time, she was not alone and not as a supplicant. She was with Ms. Choi and her brother, whose retrial had been granted. Reporters asked for a statement. Maya looked at the camera, her Korean now effortless, alive with the cadence of the city she had made her own. I came here with a question for one man. I learned that the real question was for the system itself. Will it see the evidence it chooses to ignore? My work here is not to fight one prosecutor, but to help others see their own strength. The strongest evidence is sometimes just a person refusing to be unseen. She didn't return to America. Seoul, with all its complexity and contradictions, had become the stage for her reclaimed life. She had used the language she learned in a cage to build a platform for freedom for others. The confrontation was over. The transformation was complete. The woman in the prison jumpsuit was gone. In her place stood a founder, an advocate, a fluent speaker of power. And as she walked down the courthouse steps, heading not toward a cell, but toward her small office where two communities met, the final piece of the promise made in that hook was fulfilled. She had faced the man who framed her, and in doing so, she had found a purpose bigger than revenge. So what does justice look like when the system refuses to say it was wrong? Maya Johnson's story offers a complicated answer. There was no dramatic confession, no handcuffs placed on the prosecutor, no official declaration of misconduct from the Korean or American bars. In many ways, the fortress held, but in the cracks she created, something else grew. Her victory wasn't measured in a courtroom verdict against Park Jae-hoon. It was measured in the retrial granted to Ms. Choi's brother. It was measured in the migrant workers who now walk into a clinic and find legal guidance in their own language. It was measured in the sudden, careful scrutiny applied to other cases on a prosecutor's desk. Her fight created a cost, a reputational, professional, and personal cost for ignoring the evidence. In a system built on impunity, cost is a form of accountability. Her story forces an uncomfortable question about our own proximity to injustice. We often think of wrongful convictions as catastrophic system failures, lightning strikes. The data tells a different story. They are patterns, they are choices, a rushed investigation, a coerced witness, a piece of evidence labeled inconvenient and left in a folder. And standing over that choice is often someone like Park Jae-hoon, not a cartoon villain, but a professional doing their job, perhaps a little too focused on the win, on closing the case with no noise. Maya's weapon wasn't a law degree, it was a language book. Her power wasn't in authority, but in persistence. She translated her pain into a dialect the system couldn't ignore. She made herself undeniable. In doing so, she mapped a path that exists outside the official channels of appeal and oversight, a path of sheer, stubborn visibility. For every exoneree who never gets an apology, for every family that never gets answers, her journey poses a challenge. What do you build with the time that was stolen? She built a bridge. She turned a personal reckoning into a collective resource. The Unseen Evidence Project doesn't just advocate for the innocent, it fundamentally questions what we allow to remain unseen in the first place. As for Park Jae-hoon, he remains a prosecutor in title, but not in influence. He is a living lesson in the court of public and professional opinion. Some will see his continued employment as proof the system is broken. Others will see his demotion and isolation as a quiet Korean form of justice. The truth is, he has to live with the knowledge that a woman he once condemned to oblivion learned his language, tracked him down, and held him to a standard he could not meet. In the end, she didn't need his apology. She had his attention, and in the economy of power, that is a currency all its own. The final image isn't of a courtroom showdown. It's of a small office in Seoul, where case files in English and Korean sit side by side, where a woman who was once a number is now a translator, not just of language, but of pain into purpose. Her story asks us to look at the forgotten evidence in our own worlds, the truths we choose not to see, the inconvenient questions we choose not to ask, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a verdict. It arrives with a person refusing to stay silent and a question that finally gets a hearing. If you found this story of relentless truth compelling, consider subscribing. We document the fights that reshape what's possible. Thanks for watching.